The strawberries were doing well, which surprised me because nothing else had. 11 weeks at Station Velketh South, and I had managed to keep exactly 2 of my 6 trial cultivars in acceptable condition. The Borderworld soil was right, temperate, good mineral content, drainage that behaved the way the prep report said it would, but the atmospheric pressure ran about 4% above what my calibration parameters were built for, and that 4% was doing something to the late-season fruit that I hadn't been able to account for in any of my standard models. Rows 1 through 4, stunted. The fruit came in small and pale, the skins thin, the internal cell structure compressed in ways that looked almost right from 3 paces and were completely wrong up close. Row 5 had developed a blight that spread faster than anything I'd documented in 12 years of field work, which I wrote up as a separate paper and filed with the station archive because I had nothing else to do with it, and because it was genuinely unusual and unusual things deserve records. Row 6, fine. Better than fine. The fruit from row 6 was coming in heavy and consistent, a deep red that held even in the cooler mornings when the temperature dropped enough that I could see my breath over the field shelter table. The flavor profile was something I hadn't expected, sharper than the cultivar's logged average. A pronounced front-of-mouth acid that arrived before the sweetness and stayed longer than the measurements suggested it should. I'd run the compound analysis 3 times because the first 2 results seemed wrong, and all 3 came back the same. The acid concentration was elevated. The sugar density was elevated. Both, simultaneously, in a fruit that the standard models said couldn't sustain both at once without one cannibalizing the other. I wrote that down in the field notebook with 2 question marks and a note that said, "Confirm by sensory evaluation when possible." It took me 3 more weeks to find the time for a proper sensory session, which is the kind of thing that sounds absurd when you say it out loud. I'm the only one at the station. I could have eaten a strawberry at any point in those 3 weeks. But field work has a rhythm to it, and eating your own trial fruit out of sequence feels like breaking the rhythm. And I've learned over 12 years to trust the rhythm even when I can't explain it. So it was Tuesday in the 7th week, late afternoon, the particular quality of light that the Borderworld manages at the back end of the day when the sun is still a half hour above the ridge, and the shadows are long and amber, and the whole field has a warmth to it that the instrument readings don't capture. Borderworld light has a quality I've encountered on 2 other worlds of similar atmospheric density, a thickness to it, a weight, as though the extra pressure in the air catches the photons slightly differently and holds them a little longer than they'd hold on Earth. I'd stopped trying to quantify it after the 3rd week and had simply started noting it in the daily record as a condition variable: light quality, thick and amber. The archive unit had looked at that notation on a filed copy and sent back a query asking me to use standardized luminosity descriptors. I'd replied that the standardized luminosity descriptors didn't capture what I was describing. I hadn't heard back. I was crouched at the end of row 6 with my sampling kit, getting ready to do a proper sensory evaluation alongside the instrument readings. I'd been there for about 20 minutes, pulling samples, measuring, writing things down in the careful sequence that a trial run requires. That was when I noticed her. She was standing at the field's eastern perimeter, which was marked by a low stone boundary wall that the previous station crew had built from whatever the local land provided. Irregular stones, mortared with something that had hardened to the color of the soil. She was on the far side of the wall, which put about 2 meters of distance and 30 centimeters of stone between her and the nearest point of my trial field. She was wearing VTHI standard issue field observation, where the gray-green layered fabric that's designed to manage temperature variation across a full planetary cycle, the kind of outfit that marks a researcher the way a tool kit marks a technician. She had a document case tucked under her left arm of the type I'd seen the archival research units carrying through this corridor all season, the slim rectangular VTHI issue case that packs flat and weighs almost nothing, and holds a surprising amount of documentation. Her posture was correct and formal and still. She was looking at the strawberries. Not at me, at the strawberries. Specifically at the fruit on the lower register of the row 6 plants, the ones that were hanging heaviest at this stage of the season, the dark red ones that had been my best data point for 4 weeks. She was looking at them with the particular expression that I have spent 12 years learning to recognize in researchers. The angle of the head that means active processing rather than casual looking, the stillness of a person who is observing rather than passing through, the eyes moving in the slow, methodical pattern of a systematic survey. There is a quality to how researchers look at things they want to understand, but haven't yet been given permission to touch. It's distinct from curiosity and distinct from appreciation and distinct from professional assessment, although it contains elements of all three. It's the look of a person who is doing their job with their eyes because their hands aren't yet authorized. She had that look from across a stone wall, aimed at my row 6 strawberries. I finished my end of row sample pull, packed the kit, and walked across to the boundary wall. She didn't react to my approach, which meant either she had registered me coming and was choosing not to break her observation, or she was absorbed enough in what she was looking at that she genuinely hadn't shifted attention. Either interpretation was fine. I leaned on the wall from my side with both forearms. At close range, her skin was a pale ash gray with something underneath. In the afternoon light it read as the faintest possible lavender undertone at the jaw and temple, the kind of coloration that changes with the angle of the light and might be invisible under different conditions. Her hair was cut short and close to the skull, dark bronze green, the kind of color that looks like a plant color rather than a hair color. Her eyes were almost black, deep-set, and when she moved her gaze, there was a ring at the iris edge that caught the afternoon light in a way that I recognized from certain nocturnal insects. A faint, cold, blue-white bioluminescence that was only visible when the eyes were in motion. She moved her gaze to me, and I saw it. "You're with the archive unit," I said, because the document case made it not a question. "I am attached to the corridor archival survey," she said. Her standard was careful and formal, each word placed with the deliberate precision you get from someone who learned the language from written texts rather than from speech. The grammar was impeccable, and the cadence was slightly off, the stress patterns falling on the syllables that carry the most semantic weight rather than the ones that carry the natural rhythm. "I have authorization for this area." "I'm not questioning it," I said. "You're welcome to come around to the gate if you want a closer look." She looked at the strawberries for another moment. "They are a cultivated Terran edible plant." "They are. I'm trialing a modified cultivar. The modification is for higher pressure atmospheres, theoretically. Row 6 is working. The others are teaching me things about failure I didn't know I still needed to learn." "I am familiar with the species classification," she said. "I have not encountered one in a non-archive context." In a non-archive context. She had records of them. She had processed specimen data, or she had catalog entries, or she had the full taxonomic description with the chemical composition tables and the cultivation parameters and the documented flavor profile written by researchers who had eaten the fruit, and then described what they'd experienced in the careful, precise language of academic field reports. She had all of that. She had never stood in a field next to a row of them at the end of a Tuesday afternoon in the back third of the growing season, with the ambient temperature dropping and the shadows going amber. "Gates over there," I said and pointed. She came around. Her name was Velsen. She offered it in full, the way VThi researchers tend to offer professional information, complete, formal, no diminutive, no invitation to informality. I gave her mine. She said it once to herself, quietly, the way you say a new name when you're adding it to working memory, and then she walked along the edge of row 6 with the document case still under her arm, and looked at the fruit with the same careful, systematic attention she'd been applying from the other side of the wall. She didn't touch anything. She didn't ask permission to touch anything. She observed. I went back to work. I was at the third measurement point of my sugar reading run. You pull them at 1700, same light conditions every day, same relative position in the row, or the comparative data develops a bias you can't correct for, when I became aware that she had moved to stand a few paces away from me, not looking over my shoulder, not blocking the light. Just present, the way a second person in a field is present when they understand that your work is the primary activity and their being there is the secondary one. I've worked with some researchers who struggle with that. She didn't. The modification is atmospheric pressure tolerance, she said after a while. She had been looking at the measurement data on my field tablet, which I hadn't specifically offered her access to, but hadn't taken steps to prevent. The pressure readings were right there on the screen. That's what the trial is supposed to demonstrate. Rows 1 through 5 failed in various ways I'm still writing up. Row 6 is the only cooperative subject. I held up the sample fruit I'd pulled from measurement point 3, small to medium, dense structure, good even coloration. The pressure is doing something to the flavor compound profile that I can't resolve from instrument readings alone. Instruments give me the numbers. They don't give me the sensory experience. For that you need a person. She looked at the fruit in my hand. It was a plain thing, a strawberry on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of thing that exists in hundreds of millions of gardens and markets and kitchen tables on a dozen worlds. Not rare, not unusual in any classification sense, but she looked at it with the full weight of her attention, the same systematic processing she'd been putting on everything since she came through the gate, and I had the sudden strong impression that she was experiencing something more complex than simple curiosity. "Have you ever tried one?" I asked. The pause was small but measurable, not hesitation in the anxious sense. The pause of a person running an internal evaluation, checking whether a proposed action falls within the scope of acceptable parameters, whether the action would generate data that serves a legitimate research function, whether the context justifies the departure from whatever the standard protocols were. I've seen that pause in researchers before, particularly in researchers with rigorous institutional frameworks. It's the pause of a person who has a very orderly interior life and is deciding whether to admit something slightly disorderly into it. "I have not," she said. I held it out. The second pause was longer. She was still running the evaluation. I didn't push. I kept my hand extended and waited, because you don't rush a researcher when they're in the middle of a decision, and because the fruit was hers to take or not take, and the offer was genuine either way. She took it. She held it for a moment, turning it slightly, looking at the surface. Observation before action. She was building a baseline, a before state, the way you establish instrument readings before you introduce the test variable. Then she put it in her mouth. I watched her face, because 12 years of fieldwork teaches you to watch for sensory responses in real time. It's the same instinct that makes you look at the water barometer instead of waiting for the printout, or look at the plants instead of waiting for the sensor readout to confirm what your eyes already know. I wasn't being intrusive, I was observing. Something happened to her face. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of exaggerated reaction that you see when something is designed to provoke a response. It was subtle, a slight opening of the expression, as though the muscles responsible for holding her face in its customary composure had received a signal they weren't sure what to do with. Her eyes shifted focus. Not outward, not to anything in the field or to me. Inward, the particular inward shift of focus that happens when something is occurring that requires processing resources, and you're reallocating them before you've decided whether what you're processing is pleasant or alarming or neither. The expression held for longer than a flavor evaluation warrants. I've run sensory assessment sessions with research teams on 4 worlds, and the average time a subject spends in active response to a novel flavor input is about 8 seconds. Velsen was past 30 seconds and still processing. Whatever was happening, It was not completing on the usual timeline. Then she said, "That is not what the archive description indicated. The modified cultivar runs a different acid profile than the standard entry," I said. "Front-loaded, higher concentration. It probably doesn't match any standard catalog entry. The acid is not what I am describing." She was looking at the stem between her fingers, which was all that remained. "The archive classification is accurate for composition. It does not account for—" She stopped. "For," I said. She looked at me, the near black eyes with the iris ring catching the low amber light. "I do not have a word for it," she said. She came back the next afternoon. I was at my 1700 measurement run when she arrived at the gate, and she let herself in when I didn't go to it, which I appreciated. Researchers who need formal invitation to step into a space they've already been invited into are researchers who are performing their manners rather than having them. She understood herself to be welcome. She walked the row while I worked. She had the document case under her arm again. I noticed she hadn't opened it since she arrived. "There is a SciFi classification system for sensory experience," she said, when I'd moved from the second measurement point to the third. "It has 12 primary categories and 47 subcategories. It was developed across 4 centuries of archival research methodology. Accurate sensory description is a professional standard in the archival core. When you are building a record of something, the record must include what the thing is like to experience, not only what it is composed of. The composition tells you what it is. The sensory description tells you what it does." I put down my measurement instrument. "Makes sense. The catalog needs both." "Yes." A pause. "Yesterday I attempted to file a description of the fruit's effect on my sensory processing using the classification system. I looked up from the field tablet, and none of the 47 subcategories produced an accurate result. Flat, precise. Not distressed. Velsen's register didn't carry distress the way some researchers' registers do. She reported anomalies the way instrument panels display anomalies, clearly, without editorial, waiting for analysis. The primary categories are broader, and I worked through all 12. 3 of them contain subcategories that approximate components of the experience. None of them describe the whole of it." "What happens in the archival system when you can't classify something?" I asked. "Generally, the protocol is to collect more data until classification becomes possible." She looked at the row of fruit. "May I try another one?" I pulled one from the middle third. That's where I was directing her and directing myself when I wanted representative data. Middle third, consistent weight, fruit that hadn't been stressed by end-of-row positioning or anomalous sunlight. I handed it to her. She ate it more slowly this time, deliberately. I watched her work through it, the initial bite, the way her jaw moved, the moment when the front-of-mouth acid arrived, and then the sweetness, and then the thing after both of those. She was running the classification system in parallel with the experience. I could see it in the quality of her attention, the focused, systematic quality of a person trying to match sensory input to categorical output in real time. It's a particular kind of mental effort. It has a visible quality. Then the effort softened. It didn't stop, but it softened, the way effort softens when the thing you're applying the framework to exceeds the framework's capacity, and you have to make a choice between holding the framework and registering the thing. She made the choice, briefly, unconsciously. She registered the thing. She stood in row 6 with the afternoon coming down across the red clay soil and the fruit around her in their rows, and whatever was happening in her sensory processing was happening, and for a moment she wasn't filing it. I went back to my measurement frame. After a while I said, "You don't have to classify it." She looked at me. "It is a professional standard." "It is," I said. "You can also just eat a strawberry." She considered this the way she considered everything, systematically, with full attention. Then she said, "Those are not mutually exclusive." "No," I said, "they're not. I meant you could do both in that order: the eating first, the classification attempt after, and if the classification attempt doesn't resolve, let the record reflect that. An incomplete classification is still data. She ate the rest of it. I watched her not trying for a moment, and then she was trying again, but less. The effort was there and softer, and I went back to my data sheet. She left at the same time she'd left the day before, the light going orange on the ridge, the temperature starting its evening drop. At the gate she paused and said she would return tomorrow. I said that was fine. On the third visit, she brought a small handheld instrument. It was compact, SciFi design, the kind of equipment I'd seen in medical research contexts but not in archival fieldwork. She showed it to me when she arrived, before I had to ask. A neurological response monitor, she told me, calibrated for SciFi sensory processing architecture. She had requested it from the Corridor Archival Surveys equipment pool, which had apparently raised no questions because the archival core frequently uses neurological monitoring for complex sensory documentation. She was going to try to measure from the inside what she couldn't classify from memory. I stopped my end-of-row work entirely and sat on the boundary wall with my field notebook in my lap, because this was interesting enough to warrant full attention. She attached the monitor to the inside of her left wrist, where the skin was thin. I could see the faint bioluminescent trace of the vascular network under the ash-gray surface, the same faint light that showed at the iris edge, which I noted was a consistent feature of the SciFi physiology and not something I'd encountered documented in standard cross-species field notes. She fixed the monitor's contact points carefully, the way a person handles precision equipment. Then she took a fruit from the middle third. She'd learned the sampling protocol without me explaining it, which I appreciated, and she held it in her right hand and looked at it. Then she looked at me. "You are going to watch," she said. "Yes," I said, "with your permission." "You may watch." She looked back at the fruit. "I find it easier when you watch. You observe without interpreting before the data is complete." I wrote that down in the field notebook, next to the cultivar measurements and the pressure readings and the 1700 sugar figures. I wrote, "She finds it easier when I watch. I don't interpret before the data is complete." It seemed important in a way I couldn't immediately articulate, but that 12 years of fieldwork had taught me to respect the importance of the thing that doesn't have an obvious analytical category yet. She ate the fruit. The monitor ran. The readout was in SciFi notation, which I can read slowly if the context is sufficient. I'd picked up enough over the years of working in multi-species research corridors to parse the primary classification fields. I looked at the readout over her wrist without touching the instrument. The sensory processing chain activated in the expected sequence. Tactile input, thermal input, then the chemical cascade of the flavor compounds moving through the receptor sequence. All of it reading within normal ranges, normal activation patterns, normal output timings for the categories I could read. Then, where I expected to see a classification output, the field in the SciFi sensory monitoring system, where the processed input gets assigned to a category, there was a blank. Not an error marker, not a system failure indicator. A blank. The kind of blank that appears in a well-functioning system when it has processed an input and genuinely cannot identify a matching category. "Is that normal?" I said, pointing at the blank field on the readout. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, the specific quietness of a person who has just confirmed something they suspected but hoped might resolve differently. "It is not normal." I wrote in my field notebook, SciFi neurological monitor shows unclassified output. Not a system failure, the processing chain is functioning correctly. The input produces no category match. The blank is the accurate result. "What does that mean for your archive report?" I asked. "It means the sensory description field in my documentation of this cultivar will contain an incomplete entry. She lowered her wrist. The monitor continued running for a moment, and then she deactivated it. In 12 years of archival research, I have not submitted an incomplete sensory description. I didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't anything useful to add. I'd been in field work long enough to know that the correct response to a measurement that produces an out-of-range result is not to argue with the measurement. The correct response is to understand that the range was wrong. The measurement is showing you something your framework wasn't built to see, and the framework has to expand, and that's not failure, that's research. I went back to my work. She stayed in the row. The afternoon went on in the way afternoons do in border world growing seasons, slowly, generously, the light taking its time about going. On the 4th visit she brought the monitor again. On the 5th, each time the blank field appeared at the same point in the activation sequence, consistent across trial instances, which meant it wasn't noise, it was signal. A repeatable, documentable signal that said, "This input produces an experience that the classification system does not contain." I noted in my field records that the blank field appeared at the same temporal offset from the initial flavor compound activation on every trial instance, 8.4 seconds after the front-of-mouth acid resolved, consistent to within a fraction of a second. Whatever was happening, it happened at the same moment in the processing sequence every time, which meant it was tied to a specific compound interaction or a specific sensory threshold, and I was now genuinely curious about the biochemistry. I raised the question with her on the 4th visit, after we'd run the 3rd monitor trial, and the blank field had appeared at the same offset again. I said, "The 8.4 seconds is too consistent to be noise. That's a threshold. Something crosses a threshold at that specific point in the processing sequence, and the output goes outside the classification range." She looked at the monitor readout. The front-of-mouth acid resolves at approximately that offset. The sweetness activates. Then the 3rd thing, I said. "Yes," she looked at the blank field. "There is a 3rd compound in the interaction that I have not been able to isolate." "It might not be a compound," I said. "It might be the combination. Some flavor responses aren't produced by a single compound, they're produced by a ratio. The acid concentration and the sugar density in this cultivar are both elevated simultaneously. That ratio doesn't occur in the standard cultivar. Your sensory processing architecture may never have encountered it." She was quiet for a moment with this. Then, "A ratio that occurs nowhere in the archival record." "Possibly nowhere in any archive anywhere," I said. "I bred this cultivar specifically for pressure conditions that don't exist anywhere else in the standard cultivation range. The compound ratio is an artifact of the pressure modification. It didn't exist before row 6. She looked at the row. She looked at the blank field on the monitor. She looked at me. "The experience has never occurred before," she said. "Not a question, a data point." "Not in this form," I said. "Not in this atmosphere with this cultivar with a VTHI sensory processing architecture. It's new. The blank field is the correct result." I told Velsen the same thing again on the 5th visit, when she'd brought the monitor for the 3rd consecutive session and was sitting on the boundary wall reviewing the data, and she looked at me with the near black eyes and the iris ring catching the late light and said, "You are treating this as a field study." "It is a field study," I said. "You're a sensory evaluation subject for a modified cultivar. You're showing me something the instruments can't show me. That's exactly what a sensory evaluation is for. The subject is experiencing something unclassifiable. The subject is experiencing something the current classification system doesn't have a category for," I said. "That's a different thing. The experience is real. The category doesn't exist yet. The study is finding the category." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, In archival research, when you encounter a specimen or phenomenon that falls outside existing classification, you do not discard the specimen. You expand the classification. Right, I said, same thing. She looked at the row of fruit. She looked at me. Something shifted in her expression, not the softening I'd seen when she stopped trying to classify, but something different, something more deliberate, a decision being made in real time, visible if you were paying attention. I will think about what word would be accurate, she said. She came back the next afternoon, and the one after that, and the one after that. On the sixth visit, she didn't bring the monitor. I noticed its absence and didn't comment on it, because a researcher who has removed a piece of equipment from their methodology has made a decision, and the decision will explain itself in due course. She walked the row. I worked. She ate a fruit from the middle third and stood in the row with the afternoon on her face and the iris ring catching the light, and whatever was happening in her sensory processing was happening without equipment, without a classification attempt, without any visible effort at analysis. Just experience, held for a few seconds longer than most things are held in a trial field. I watched because she had said it was easier when I watched. The afternoon before her departure, she came to stand near the entrance of the field shelter, where the edge of the roof shadow fell. Not inside the shelter. She'd never come inside the shelter, but near the entrance, in the transition between the late light and the shade. She had the document case under her left arm. She was looking at the row. "My assignment in this corridor ends in 6 days, she said. "I know," I said. "You're on the Velanreth relay departure. It goes up on the board 2 weeks out." "Yes," a pause. "I have been attempting to file the sensory description for 9 days. "How many drafts?" 41. She said it without a flicker of drama. 41 draft entries in 9 days, none of them accurate. I did the arithmetic, roughly 4.5 per day, which meant she was working on it outside of our field sessions, at her station desk or in the archive tent, or wherever the corridor survey unit was camped, sitting with a blank classification form and trying to find the words that fit. The classification system describes the chemical composition correctly, the acid profile, the sugar density parameters, the thermoreceptor cascade sequence. All of this is within the system's capacity and produces accurate entries. She paused. But She stopped. I looked up from the data sheet. She was in the shade at the shelter entrance, and her expression had the quality of a person working at the outermost edge of their vocabulary, not distressed, because Velsen was constructed for precision rather than distress, but genuinely at the boundary of what her language could do. She was looking at me the way a researcher looks at an instrument that is showing a reading that doesn't fit any of the labeled scales. "The thing that happens," she said, "after the acid and the sweetness, the thing the monitor shows as a blank field, I have been trying to identify the nearest Vithi equivalent for 9 days. She adjusted the document case under her arm. "There is a word we use for a specific form of recognition. Not identification. We have a separate and more precise word for identification. This word is for the experience of recognizing something you did not know you had been looking for. The recognition of a thing you needed before you were aware of the need." The afternoon outside the shelter was quiet. The border world kind of quiet that has presence rather than absence. The wind at low volume on the ridge, the sound of things growing. "Is that it?" I asked. "Is that the word?" "It is the closest word in the language." She looked at the row. "It is not perfectly accurate. The experience the strawberry produces is more immediate than the word implies. The word carries a quality of reflection, of recognizing in retrospect, whereas the experience in the field is immediate, present tense. But of all 47 subcategories and 12 primary categories, and every adjacent term I have considered, this is the most accurate available word. And it is the word I have been looking for, which is itself a small instance of the thing it describes." I was already writing. She said the word for me. 3 syllables, the middle one elongated, the final consonant a near silence, more exhalation than friction. I asked her to say it again. She did. I wrote the romanization as carefully as I could manage, which was imperfect but serviceable. I wrote beneath it the definition she had given me, in her own words, the experience of recognizing something you did not know you had been looking for. Then I wrote, produced by the modified acid profile in the cultivar developed for higher pressure environments, interacting with Vithi's sensory processing architecture at 8.4 seconds post-acid resolution. First documented instance of unclassifiable response in researcher's active archive career. I wrote one more line. I wrote, first documented sensory experience of this cultivar in a non-archive context. I turned the notebook so she could see it. She read it. She read it the way you read something that you have been trying to write for 9 days and that someone else has now written in a form that is accurate slowly, with full attention, rereading the third line twice. Your field records include subjective sensory experience data, she said. They always have. The instruments give me the numbers, they don't give me the experience. Field work without subjective record is half a field record. I looked at what I'd written. Your description is data. It goes in the notebook with everything else. The attribution, she said, for the 41 drafts I produced. You found the word, I said. The attribution is yours. She set the document case down on the corner of the shelter table. She opened it, the first time she had opened it in front of me in 9 days. Inside, archive field sheets, the thin Vithi stock with pre-printed classification grids, covered in her careful, dense, precise notation. She took a blank sheet from the back of the stack. She asked me to say the word back to her, the romanization I'd written. I said it and she corrected the middle syllable elongation, and I said it again, and she nodded once, which was the confirmation I'd come to understand meant accurate. Then she wrote the word in her own script, and the romanization beside it, and beneath them an archive entry. She translated it aloud as she wrote, sentence by sentence, with the particular precision of a person constructing a formal record and wanting the record to be known. Subject, Terran edible plant, cultivar modified for atmospheric pressure tolerance, trial row 6, station Velketh South, border world corridor. Sensory evaluation conducted over 9-day active trial period. Primary classification fields, accurate within standard system parameters. Residual response, unclassifiable via the 47 subcategory framework. Closest available descriptor, the Vithi term for the experience of recognizing something the observer did not know they had been looking for. First documented instance of unclassifiable sensory response in researcher's 11-year active archive career. Notation: the accurate record requires a term the system did not contain before this field session. She stopped, then she added one more line and she translated it. The human researcher provided the conditions in which the accurate record became possible. She slid the sheet across the shelter table to me. I read it once and then again, slowly, because it deserved to be read carefully. Then I reached into the field notebook and tore a page from it cleanly, the page with my entry, the word in romanization, the definition, the attribution. I slid it back. For your archive, I said, both sides of the field record. She looked at it. Then she folded it once and put it in the inner pocket of the field observation jacket, the sealed one, where researchers put things they are not going to lose. She didn't put it in the document case. She put it in the pocket. We stood in the shelter for a moment, and then outside in the last of the afternoon, because the shelter had grown too small for standing still, and the field was the right size. Row 6 was in the low amber light, with the season's last fruit coming in heavy and dark, and the air had that quality it gets at the end of a growing day in a good field, cool and alive, the specific alive quality of things that are in the process of becoming. I've worked in enough fields to know that this quality is present whether anyone is in the field or not. But there are days when you're the one standing in it, and it's different from days when it's only a report in a notebook. I will complete the corridor assignment and return to the main archive on Velorath Station, Velsin said. I know. The modified cultivar trial. If the yield report produces a publishable result, the archive will receive a filed copy. It will. The full field record, including the sensory evaluation data and the attribution. I looked at row 6. The blank field in the neurological monitor record is going in the appendix as an instrument anomaly, with a note that the anomaly is actually the accurate result. I'll footnote the classification term. She was quiet for a long moment. You will use the word, she said, in the published record. If the record is accurate, the word goes in, I said. That's how it works. She looked at row 6. She looked at it the way she'd been looking at it from the other side of the boundary wall on the first afternoon, that systematic, careful, research mode attention, except that the effort was entirely gone now. The framework she'd been working against for 9 days had been set down, because she'd found the word, and the word was in the record, and the record was accurate, and she was standing in a trial field at the end of a Tuesday afternoon looking at strawberries without trying to classify them. The word also applies to this, she said, not only to the fruit. She was not looking at me when she said it, and I understood that to be intentional. I came to this corridor for the archival survey. I did not know before I arrived that a station like this existed here, or that a researcher working alone in a trial field would keep this kind of record. I did not know I had been looking for a place where an unclassifiable experience would be treated as data. I wrote in the field notebook. She says the word applies to the station as well as the fruit. I wrote it because it was data, and because the accurate record includes the data that arrives unexpectedly. How many days before the departure? I asked. 6, she said. Come back tomorrow. Middle third of row 6 needs another week of measurement runs before I close the season, and the sensory evaluation data is richer with more trial instances. I could use a co-evaluator. I looked at the row. I'll add you to the field record as a research associate. Formal attribution. The published report will carry your name. She was quiet for long enough that I thought I'd miscalculated something. Then she looked at me with the near black eyes, and the iris ring steady in the last amber light of the afternoon. I can return tomorrow, she said. She went to the gate, and at the gate she paused, and I thought she was going to say something else, but she didn't. She let herself out and went. I stood at the end of row 6 for a while after the gate closed. She came back the next afternoon, and the one after that. Over the remaining 6 days, she arrived at the gate in the late morning and worked the row alongside me, not conducting her own measurements. She never tried to take over the trial protocol, but present, sometimes pulling a measurement instrument from my kit when I needed a second hand, reading the output numbers back while I recorded them, asking precise questions about the methodology that required precise answers and produced, on 2 occasions, improvements to the measurement sequence that I incorporated into the permanent protocol notes and attributed to her. She was thorough and quiet and efficient, which are the 3 qualities I value most in a field partner. And she was also something else that I don't have a standard field record category for, which is to say she was good company in the specific way that a person is good company when they are entirely themselves and not performing any version of themselves for any audience. On the 5th day, she brought a new archive sheet and began a second formal entry, an expanded one, longer than the first, documenting what she described as the 9-day development of a classification framework for a previously unclassifiable sensory experience, which she was treating as a methodological case study. She read me the entry as she wrote it, sentence by sentence, in the same way she'd translated the first one. the careful, weight-bearing sentences of a person who is building a record and wants the record to be known. On the last morning, she walked the full length of row 6 from one end to the other. Slowly, not pulling anything, not measuring, not taking notes. Just walking the row in the early light before I'd started the measurement run, while the dew was still on the fruit and the temperature was low and the border world showed what it looked like before the day had a chance to warm it. I watched her from the shelter entrance with my coffee, the instant powder kind that is the permanent condition of field stations. And she walked the row the way you walk a path you've learned by doing the same work on it every day, which is to say with the ease of a person who knows where they are. At the end of the row she stopped. I came down from the shelter to meet her. She reached across and pulled a fruit from the middle third without me offering it, her own choice, her own timing, and she ate it standing at the end of the row with the morning light on her ash-gray face, and the iris ring catching the early-hour version of the light that was colder and bluer than the afternoon version, and made her look for a moment like the photograph in an archive rather than a person in a field. Then she was a person in a field again. She ate the strawberry the way you eat something when you know what it is, not because you've classified it, but because you've understood it as the thing it is, which is different and more than classification. She took the document case from under her arm and opened it, and from the sealed inner pocket, not the archive sheets section, she removed the notebook page I'd given her on the 9th day, unfolded it carefully, and handed it back. "I have transcribed it into the formal archive record," she said. "You should keep the original." I took it. She had added writing in the margin, her own notation, the Vithai script, and beneath it in standard, "Return this when you have a use for the word. You will." I folded it once and put it in the inner pocket of my field jacket, where I put things I don't want to lose. She looked at row 6 for the last time. "The yield report," she said. "I'll complete it and transmit it to the archive when the season closes in 3 weeks," I said. "Your name will be on it. Co-evaluator, attribution for the sensory classification development." "And the word," she said. "And the word," I said, "in the text and in the appendix." She held my gaze for a moment, one of those moments that has a weight to it that you feel after the fact, in the evening when you're writing up the day's records and you come to that part of the afternoon and sit with the pen in your hand longer than the writing requires. Then she went. I stood at the end of row 6 for a while after the gate closed behind her. The morning came up across the field in the way border world mornings do, generous with light, taking its time, the kind of morning that a person who has been working a trial field for 12 weeks has learned to appreciate rather than simply note. I opened the field notebook. I wrote day 22, row 6, final week of the season, yield consistent and above trial projections. Flavor compound profile confirmed on all measurement instances. Elevated acid concentration, elevated sugar density, both present simultaneously in a cultivar configuration that the standard models said couldn't sustain both. The measurement was correct. The model was wrong. I wrote, co-evaluator Velsen departed this morning for the Velanreth relay departure. Archive entry for sensory evaluation complete. Classification term identified. The blank field in the neurological monitor record has been resolved, not a system failure. An accurate result in a system that had encountered a phenomenon outside its existing categories. I wrote, the classification system can be expanded. The record can contain what the system could not contain before. That is what field work is. Then I wrote the last line, the one that I'd been turning over in my mind since the 9th day, since she'd said the word applied to the station as well as the fruit. I did not know before I arrived that this was a place I had been looking for. I wrote it because it was accurate. In field work, the accurate record is the only record worth keeping. I closed the notebook. Outside, row 6 sat in the morning with the season's last fruit dark and heavy in the rows. and the light came down across the red clay soil, the way light comes down on things that are worth growing. And there was no one else in the field, and the field was full.